Hi, and welcome to part 3 of Praise Behavior Services ABA training. In Module 7, we're going to be talking about how to avoid instructional errors. Applied behavior analysis is a powerful tool for teaching new skills. In recent years, Gina Green has carried out several practical studies to see what strengthens the learning of children with developmental delays and what makes it difficult. Again, a stimulus is a change in the environment which can affect behavior. A girl sees a teddy bear in a store and she points and she shouts, "Teddy bear." So, what was the stimulus change here? It was seeing that teddy bear in the store. So, that we say the response, "Teddy bear," is under the control of the sight of the teddy bear here. So let's say that you had a learner, David, who had difficulty recognizing his name in writing. You decided to teach him to point out his name in an array of 3 cards with his name printed on the correct card. And you can also see there's a supplemental photo of David on the correct card. Point to your name, David. Wow. 3 sessions of 100%. He's got it. Let's just take away this photo now. Point to your name, David. Oh, he knew it before. Point to your name, David. Oh, what happened? I know that he knew the answer. Well, defective stimulus control is when a response is under the control of an irrelevant stimulus. So what went wrong here? One error here was that we put a supplemental stimulus on the card with David's name. The problem is that this image became a symbol for David. The card that is different is the correct answer. What this means is that David didn't even have to look at the written names. In fact, he didn't even have to recognize that it was a photo of himself. As we can see when we remove the photo, Dave no longer, quote unquote, recognizes his name. And this was because he never learned to recognize his name in the first place. So if you're thinking, well, what if we had faded out the photo more gradually? Again, if you have a supplementary stimulus on the correct answer that's different from all the other cards, so no other cards here had photos, you're signaling to the learner that they don't even have to look at the other cards or even fully attend to the current card to respond. They just know that the correct answer is right here. So how can we avoid this defective stimulus control? Here are some general tips. Don't use prompts that have not been planned for or used systematically. One great tip would be to use errorless learning. We never want to use positional prompt. A positional prompt would be where you put the correct card a little bit closer to the learner than the other cards. When you do this, they learn that they just need to point to the closer card and they don't need to attend to the images on any of the cards. So if you're going to use prompts, do it in stages. Removing it too early can cause acquisition difficulties and frustration. That was kind of a problem here. We took off that photo too fast. But again, we either use photos on all the cards or we don't use photos. And one really important tip here is to use mixed trials. What is a mixed trial? This would be where you switch between different types of SDs or programs during a session. This is going to improve stimulus control. Mixed trials also keeps problem behavior at bay because the learner doesn't get bored. This is going to increase child engagement, and it is also much more effective and precise than training in isolation. Training in isolation would be just one trial or one program. Here's an example of a session using mixed trials. What's this? Apple. What's your name? Michael. Clap your hands. How old are you? 4. What's this? Book. So what's happening here? What's happening here is that we did not do a block of just tack, 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 tack. What's this? We switched between different programs. So what's this? We had a tact. What's your name? We had an interverbal, so we had a verbal exchange here. Clap your hands. We did a listener response trial here. How old are you? We went to an interverbal, and what's this? We went to a tact. Basically, a best practice would be to try to mix trials between 2 or 3 different programs. You might have more programs than that, but it can just be 2 or 3 different ones. So what are some other common errors in ABA? You might see something where you have training in isolation. So they might do a block of 10 tacting trials in a row. Either way, what you want to do to avoid that is you want to use several exemplars between each trials. You always want to use multiple comparisons within each trial. So you always want to have at least 3 different stimuli. When you have one stimuli, so if you're asking them, point to your name and there's just one card that says David, this one stimuli does not require any discrimination. You would not want to do that. When you have 2 stimuli, so if you showed a card of David and one card of Manuel, this does not require much discrimination, and the child may get that minimum average score by chance, because when you have 2 cards, you always have 50% of a chance to get the correct answer, correct? When you have 3 stimuli, you're providing at least a reasonable assurance that the learner is actually making a discriminated response. And no, this will not confuse the learner. And if they're unable to recognize their name by discriminating, they can't truly recognize their name. So let me show you an example of training in isolation. Here we just put one stimulus in front of the child. We put a doll in front of the child and we hold up a card and we ask them, find same. They're not making any discrimination here. They find same. Yes. Find same. You found the house. Good job. Find same. Find that stimuli. Cool, you did it. Now we're ready. They're pointing. They're doing it so fast. We've got this. I am going to put all 3 stimuli together and see what happens. Find same. What do you guys think is going to happen here? They were unable to find same. They pointed to doll here. When you use training in isolation and you don't require discrimination, you're going to waste a lot of time learning and relearning concepts. That learner is going to spend a lot of time learning and relearning concepts. Some general tips here. You want to make sure that you are alternating between cards or options and using all the same number, the same percentage of the time. You want to mix up cards, randomize those cards between every trial. You want to make sure that you are alternating between positions of the correct answer here, using each position the same percentage of the time. And you also want to avoid reducing the options until there is only one possibility. So we're not going to be teaching by way of the process of elimination, basically. And you also do not you should not present the same item or stimulus for more than 2 consecutive trials. Randomization is the key here. You also should keep an eye out, and this should be your BCBA supervisor keeping an eye out here, but just keep in mind too, for example, the first phase of PECS works with only 1 card. Learner's not making a discrimination. So when you implement PECS, make sure that you change that up and start off with 3 cards. There are also programs in the VB map that they might ask for an array of 2 mans or 2 imitations. It's one thing when your supervisor is scoring that full protocol, but when you teach, you always want to make sure you're working with that minimum of 3 stimuli. Let's take a look at a worksheet here. What is wrong with this worksheet here? We have, we're going to connect to the words. We've got the horse, pig, and cow, 3 different stimuli. And I said 3 stimuli is important, but what's the problem? On the first trial, there's no problem here. We have 33% of a chance of getting the correct answer for each stimuli here. What happens after that, though, after you connect that cow to the word cow, each other stimuli has 50% of a chance of being correct. And once you get that second stimuli, horse to horse, it's 100% of a chance of being correct. So just kind of a signal to just pay attention, because we want to avoid learning situations that involve the process of elimination, especially in reference to situations with less than 3 options. If it has more than 3 options, it's really not a big deal, but just keep this in mind. There are a number of easy training mistakes that instructors make. They might have a side bias where the learner does not need to discriminate. And so, or a position bias, side bias, position bias, same thing. So you might see that the instructor is always putting the correct answer on the left or something. So the learner starts just always pulling from the left. And that even the learner can develop a side bias there when that happens. Just keep that in mind. You also want to avoid reinforcing responses made with scrolling or guessing. What would this look like? This would look like you have an array of 6 cards. You ask the learner, point to horse, and the learner points to cow, dog, cat, and eventually they make it over to horse. Well, you're not going to reinforce that answer. You don't want to reinforce that scrolling or guessing. Here, the learner is not discriminating. They're waiting for you to give positive feedback. So when this happens, the moment they already make that first mistake, they point to cow, jump in right there with a prompt and help them identify the correct response. This trial should be scored as an error or answer given with prompt. It should not be scored as correct, but it's something important to keep in mind. You should also avoid reinforcing responses made at times when the learner was not attending when made. So you've got the array in front of the learner, you ask the learner to point to cow, they're staring out the window, but by chance they point to cow. Don't give them points for that. Pick up those cards, randomize it, ask again another time, but that should not be considered a correct answer. You also want to avoid giving the SD or a demand without getting the learner's attention. I mean that's on us. We should make sure that they are attending, both when we give the SD and when they make their response. Okay. Here's a list of some common mistakes and how we can fix them. There is the error of win, stay, lose shift. There is side bias. We also see prompt dependency, and that's when the learner waits to be prompted with a correct response. There's also the error of the child just needs one trial to catch on, and the instructor's gaze error. Let's look at each of these a little more in depth. When we are looking at win, stay, lose shift, this is the type of error in which the learner is under the defective control of the last stimulus associated with being correct, and the stimulus associated with being wrong is avoided. So if car was right last time, I'm going to point to car this trial, and I don't even need to pay attention to what you're saying. Bike was wrong last trial. Well, I'm going to shift to something else because shifting tends to result in reinforcement, and that has nothing to do, again, with anything it is that you are saying. So how do you fix win, stay, lose, shift? Well, first of all, you need to make sure that each stimulus is associated with being right as often as it is associated with being wrong. This teaches the learner to attend to the relevant stimuli, which would be the SD for the response, the instruction, right? So if you have 3 stimuli, you're going to ask for for each stimulus 3 times, right? Or as close to that as possible. The important thing here, though, is you never want to give an SD for an item because the learner will get it right because they always go for it. This is just going to make the situation worse. So let's take a look at an example here. You always want to make sure to use all stimuli. And during this trial, I want you to pay attention to these 2 cards, to the apple and the house. I'm using these cards as quote unquote distractor cards. And unfortunately, I have seen this done in the clinic. You should not do this. You should never use a distractor card. This would be a card that you put in an array just to, meet the requirements of having an array of, 3 or 5 or whatever, but you never ask for these cards. Okay, so what happens when you use distractor cards? Let's say your real targets here are cat, dog, and cat. Cat, dog, and car. Sorry about that. So you say point to dog here, and you have those distractor cards of the apple in the house, which you never ask for. You ask the learner to point to dog. He's got it. Yes. Show me the cat. I'm never going to ask for the apple or the house, but show me cat. You pointed to cat. Where's the car? I'm not asking again for the apple or the house. And they pointed to the car. Good job. So you noticed again how the house and apple were never called. These were distractor cards. The idea was not to confuse the learner, but what's the problem when you use distractor cards? And obviously, like in a real trial, you wouldn't be saying out loud or signaling to the learner, I'm not going to ask for apple or house. But again, never use distractor cards. End of sentence. So what's the problem here? When you take out the distractor cards, you notice right here, I don't have that apple or house, and I put together the three actual targets which would be dog, cat, and car. Without the distractor cards, when you say point to dog, the learner is unable to point to the dog. The problem is that we only taught that house and apple were always wrong answers, and the child only learned how not to point to these cards. He didn't actually learn what dog, cat, or car was. So I really want to emphasize distractor cards are just a waste of you and your learner's time. Basically, you taught the learner win, stay, lose, shift. Okay. So what are some other common errors? There's also lateral or position bias, and this is where a certain location becomes associated with correct answers, and the learner always selects the item in that position regardless of whatever it is you're saying. So you might notice, but you're always putting the correct card on the left. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Where's star? They pointed to star there on the left. Where's the triangle? They pointed to the triangle. They got it again in the same position. Where's the heart? They got it again, same position. You're even creating that side bias in the learner. So you can test this out. If you've created a side bias, you can say, where is the blah, blah, blah. They will continue to point to the card in that same position. This should be a really easy mistake to make, to avoid. Really easy. It is an easy mistake to make. It's also an easy mistake to avoid. So just try to pay attention to something like that. How do you correct position bias? You want to make sure that the correct item is in each available location the same number of times. So if you have 3 items and you have 3 locations, switch the position every time for the stimuli and the location of that target stimulus. Okay. Another common error that we see is prompt dependency, and this is when the learner waits for the prompt. And you're not even going to see any response for them before the prompt is delivered. This often occurs when there is too much differential reinforcement being used, or the reinforcers are too weak to evoke the response. So how do you fix prompt dependency? You want to make sure that you find more effective reinforcers. Make sure the learner is picking up the reinforcer, looking at it, engaging with it when they have it. You also might want to use a time delay prompt, which we talked about in the last module. Basically, you're going to then increase the latency between the SD or the instruction and the prompt or hint. So the time between the demand and giving the prompt. But you basically just want to make sure you're using stronger reinforcers for correct responses that induce correct responses that induce independent answers. There's also the error of they just need a trial to catch on. Here it's going to seem like the first trial is always wrong and the rest are right. This means that stimulus control is much more in the style of win, stay, lose, shift. So basically, they're deducing what you want them to do, and that's not because they're listening to whatever it is that you're saying. This is going to create a problem for maintenance, generalization, and for the addition of exemplars. So imagine seeing a block of 10 trials of looking at a person who has called your name. Okay, so you say the kid's name, he has to look at you with eye contact to get it correct. So, Bobby, oops, remember to look at me. Bobby, you looked at me. Bobby, that's so cool, you looked. So the first time they don't do it, but then they look at you all the other times. So after quote unquote mastering it, strangely, you try calling their name mid-session and they don't looked. So what happened here? Basically, what's happening is that the learner is just looking at you by chance. There's no association being made that they need to look at you when you say Bobby. If the learner is unable to look at you in response to their name during a mixed trial, they have not truly learned to respond with eye contact when they hear their name. They haven't truly learned that skill. So what's another common error? We also have the error of the instructor's gaze or touch. So really, it's so important. Never underestimate your learner. It's really not uncommon to move your target stimulus last when rotating stimuli before delivering that instruction or SD. It's also not uncommon to look at the target stimulus before or after giving that SD or demand. So remember, the learner is watching you. His behavior may come under the control of the last thing you touch or whatever it is you're looking at and fail to come under the control of what it is you're asking. So to correct this error, make sure you do not inadvertently provide prompts to the learner. This is going to be a big problem when you think that the learner has mastered a program and later that child surprisingly doesn't have that skill anymore. Here are just some final thoughts. To avoid difficulties with acquiring and generalizing new skills, be aware that repeated mistakes interfere with the process. There is a lot of scientific evidence for the use of errorless learning. Errorless learning has a bigger scientific basis than the use of trial and error. It's also it's a great idea to require a response that shows that the child is paying attention before each trial. Maybe you don't give the instruction until the child makes eye contact with you. It also might be a good idea to present the stimulus on a board so that they can't see the order you put those stimuli down, and it's just not obvious where you put the last card. You put it on the board and then you present it. And I've definitely used that one before. Here are the references from this module. It is time for the Module 7 review. So please get out your worksheets and answer the questions on your worksheet. Okay, here's Module 7, question 1. Defective stimulus control is when? Question 2, again, if you need to pause the video, feel free. What does it mean to use mixed trials? Question 3, mixed trials do all of the following except. Question 4, true or false? Positional prompts are a great way to increase correct responding and avoid errors. Question 5, what is win, stay, lose, shift? Question 6, how do you know if the kid you are working with has a side bias? How is side bias or position bias corrected? True or false? It's a good sign when the learner just needs one trial to catch on because it shows that now they're paying attention and everything else will be correct. You have completed Module 7. Module 8, Pairing, Assent, and Instructional Control. In this module, we're going to be looking at the definition of informed consent and requirements, assent, pairing, and instructional control. The BACB Code of Ethics, obtaining informed consent. Behavior analysts are responsible for knowing and complying with all conditions under which they are required to obtain informed consent from client stakeholders and research participants. They're responsible for explaining, obtaining, reobtaining, and documenting informed consent required. They are responsible for obtaining informed consent from clients where applicable. While we are legally obligated to obtain written informed consent from a child's legal representative to begin treatment, what about the child? The word assent refers to a non-legal minor demonstrating agreement to participate in treatment through their behavior. A child that is crying and running away from their therapist is not giving their assent to participate in ABA. On the other hand, a child that's smiling, eagerly putting their tokens on their token boards, showing positive body language like eye contact, smiles, body oriented towards the therapist during ABA is giving their assent. We seek to obtain assent from all our clients before starting treatment each day. Gaining assent shows that we place importance on the child's independence. The child can make their own decisions. We are seeking to create an environment of trust and increase the child's motivation. This bond guarantees our success. It's essential to obtain a child's or a client's assent through pairing before beginning instructions or implementing a behavioral intervention. Obtaining assent first each day is a best practice for obtaining instructional control. So how do we build rapport with the child? How do we create that bond? Well, first, you could do that through play. You could first start by observing the child playing, imitate the play. You could show interest. You can echo their vocalizations, repeat what they say. But instead of just being directive, you could reformulate any errors made, but you don't want to make demands in these situations. If the learner is showing resistance during playtime, this might not be a good time. So wind down that playtime calmly and try again later. What are our criteria for assent? During our session, we want to see that our client spends their time chilled out, engaged, and happy. If we don't have these conditions, it's time to return to building rapport and get assent from the client before continuing with programs. Make sure that these instances are part of your session notes and discussed with your supervisor. Basically, though, children learn from people they like. Here are some prerequisites for gaining instructional control. Start off with, does the child show assent by giving a toy back to an adult? Does the child show assent by sitting at the table and or the floor facing the adult? Does the child show assent by accepting physical guidance hand over hand to complete activities? If the answer is no to any of these, it's important to teach these skills before proceeding. So what's next? Once these requirements have been met, these are the following steps. Through observation or preference assessment, create a list of reinforcers for that child. You also want to choose items that you can control. You want to be the bridge between the item and the child. So if that child's reinforcer is tablet time, you're going to be the one holding that tablet. You're not just going to hand it over yet because it might be hard to get it back. Pairing is another process of building a bond. So you want to try to show that you're fun, you're that bridge to receiving reinforcers. You want to maintain enjoyable shared time with the child, offer options, follow that child's assent, pair yourself or associate yourself with reinforcement. You want to start slowly then to insert easy demands. So show that following instructions prolongs the enjoyable time. So for the first command, select commands that are behaviors that the child already does or are most likely to happen in that moment. Don't start with the hard stuff. You want to make sure you get eye contact, approach the child, make eye contact, say that command only once. And if necessary, take that child's hand and provide physical guidance for the child to follow through. Later, we're going to reduce this aid. And like I said, this is why it's so important that accepting physical guidance is a prerequisite. If the child did it, by all means, reinforce it. At first, we want to offer reinforcement after every correct response, even if performed with physical guidance, okay? But gradually, we're going to fade this out. Try to pair tangible reinforcements, like toys or edibles, with social reinforcement, praise, hugs, etc. You want to be really specific with your social reinforcement. That's cool. You gave me plain. You found sane. That reinforcement should immediately and directly follow the child's behavior. If the child didn't do it, don't reinforce it. We want to show that following instructions is reinforcing, but this reinforcement is only available by completing the demand. So it may be beneficial to explain these differences with that first then board that we talked about in an earlier module. You also want to gain momentum and encourage the child to comply. So you might want to try inserting a more difficult demand after one or a small series of easy responses. Behavioral momentum can be used to gain compliance to difficult or non-preferred tasks by breaking it down into smaller tasks and building up to harder ones too. So, for example, picking up all the toys may seem overwhelming to a small child. You might want to start with specific items, start with the dolls, and reinforce that small success. When you have many small successes, this will lead more easily to one big one. Here are some pro tips. Don't use the word no. Don't use no, no prompts. Don't jump. Don't bite. Stop. Talking specifically about behavior increases the frequency of that behavior. Talk about what you should do at that moment, not what you shouldn't do. So instead of saying don't jump, let's sit over here. Those commands must be simple and clear. You also want to catch our kiddos behaving. Let them know how great it is when they are behaving and how often is it that they only get attention when they do the opposite. For many children, it's very valuable to have quality attention. Make this attention both probable and accessible for good behavior. You also want to keep your cool. Don't take the problem behavior personally. Remember, it's maintained by the consequence. That child is not manipulating you. Be sure to respond with an even tone. And if the function is attention, do not provide any verbal interaction. Keep your cool and don't give up. We also really work by creating a bond of trust with a child, giving commands that are for their benefit and well-being. The child needs to trust that we will keep our word. Reinforcers offered and not provided after the behavior will corrupt the effectiveness of the program. If a person engages in a particular behavior, the environment has supported it in the past. Changing behavior involves looking at the environment to determine precisely what needs to be changed. So stop and think about how this isn't a contradiction from the other steps. We're really talking about structuring the environment to help support that child and stop providing reinforcement for problem behavior. Start providing reinforcement for appropriate behavior and supporting them in those actions. If you show a child that you're going to say a demand 1,000 times before they fulfill it or don't fulfill it, that is exactly what will happen. Remember not to make a request unless you intend to have or help the child follow through. So if you give in after a period of time, your child will quickly learn that they just need to hold out a little bit longer than you do, and they will. Remember that doing what is easy now to solve the behavior could result in long-term continuation of the problem. Do the right thing, not the easy thing. And also remember to choose your battles. It usually makes sense to help a child start small to build tolerance based on assent first. Just keep in mind, you may need to build a rapport again, one or multiple times. It's not the case that you just simply build rapport when you first meet that child and that bond is guaranteed for the rest of time. When they're having a bad day, you may need to back off a little bit and we'll work on building rapport. Okay, we have reached the Module 8 review. Please get out your worksheets and answer your questions there. Be sure and pause if you need. Module 8, question 1. What do you need to do first in order to obtain instructional control? Question 2. All of the following are prerequisites for obtaining instructional control except question 3. True or false? In the beginning of obtaining instructional control with a child, you should only reinforce behavior when the child follows commands while smiling. Question 4. What is behavioral momentum? You have finished Module 8. Module 9, the learner's programming. A skill acquisition program is put together by a behavior analyst and contains the learner's programming as well as strategies to help the learner acquire skills. It contains the goal of the program, the SD or discriminative stimulus, the environmental arrangement, criteria for correct response, the instructor behavior for the correct response, a description of possible incorrect responses, as well as instructor behavior for incorrect responses, such as prompting strategies, as well as a mastery criterion. Knowing what is on the skill acquisition program helps us prepare for our session. What items do we need for this session? Reinforcers, toys, flashcards, etc. Do we understand the programming? Ask your supervisor to explain or model how to run programming. The goal and the environmental arrangement are meant to give you the name of the skill and a description of the skill, as well as the material needed. For example, Freddie will tact 10 non-reinforcing items. A description of the environmental arrangement may be as follows. 3 non-reinforcing items present. Items 1 through 3, bat, ball, and doll. A discriminative stimulus, or SD, is a statement which set the occasion for the reinforcement of a specific response in the past. So, for example, asking, "What is your name?" is a discriminative stimulus that shows the learner that there is reinforcement available for saying Bobby. Basically, the SD is a nice word here that means the signal for the response. You could almost just as easily call these the instructions, but in some cases, the SD won't be an obvious verbal command. So we give it this fancy name that makes us seem like really smart. The SD must be delivered exactly as described. This is the most important for programs dealing with learning how to learn skills. Here's some examples of SDs. With echoic, we have the verbal SD, say mm. For the tact, we have 2 different SDs. We have that image of the car as well as the verbal SD, what's this? With a listener response trial, you might have an array of 5 cards, including a card with a bike, and the verbal SD, point to bike. With a mand, you might have a teddy bear up on a high shelf with a possible verbal SD of, what do you want? With independent play, you might have a car and a racetrack in front of the child with a possible verbal SD of, let's play. With a visual perception trial, you might have an array of 10 cards in front of the child, 1 card with a cat, as well as the instructor holding up a picture of a cat and the verbal SD, point to same. Notice here in this independent play trial, we did not say, let's race, let's play with a car, or anything else of that nature. We gave a general let's play. This is not a listener response trial, and we don't want the child to race the car in response to that specific command. We want the true SD to be the car itself. What's a consequence for an independent play trial? The consequence here is just verbal praise and or a backup reinforcer. One day we hope that just playing with the toys will be reinforcing enough. What about a typical verbal perception trial? You would have SDs such as an array of 10 cards in front of 10 cards in front of the child, 1 card with a plane, the instructor holding up another picture of a plane with the verbal SD, point to same. Here again, the SDs are both images and words. We did not specifically say point to plane. This would make this a learner response trial. We just said point to same. With imitation, you might have a verbal SD of do this, and the instructor would give a motor imitation such as touching nose, or a motor action such as touching nose for the child to imitate that. With interverbal, we'd give the verbal SD. What do you like to do, for example? With imitation, again, we didn't say touch your nose. We just gave a general do this. Saying touch your nose would be a learner response trial. And with a learner response by function feature class, we might have an array of 8 cards in front of the learner with a verbal SD, something like you sit on a, for them to respond pointing to chair. We're also going to give the criteria for the correct response and a description of what that correct response looks like. It's important to know that if you are teaching a learner to verbally request a teddy bear, it is an incorrect response if the learner simply points to the teddy bear. They need to verbally request that teddy bear. Um, with a tact trial, here's an example of what it would look like on the programming. For example, within 5 seconds of the SD and 2 seconds after the prompt, the child labels the item. After the learner gives the correct response, we should reinforce the correct response. And the programming information should instruct something like this. Praise paired with reinforcer, and do not deliver the item tacted. You should say something like, nice job naming baby. Make eye contact with the child. It should be clear if and when we give a token. Are we giving 1 token for every correct response, or 1 token for every 2 to 4 correct responses? The learner's programming should also contain a description of what an incorrect response looks like. And there are many different kinds of incorrect responses. Let's take a look here. One type is obviously just giving the wrong answer. You say high five, the child touches elbow. Incorrect. The child doesn't respond. You say high five, and the child keeps his hands in his lap. That would be the incorrect response. An inappropriate or delayed response is also incorrect. You say high five, and the learner touches his head, then immediately gives a high five, or the learner gives a high five after a 10-second delay. Other incorrect responses would include scrolling, which means guessing until they find the correct answer. You say point to cat, they point to dog, cow, etc. Finally, they change to cat while looking at you and waiting for that feedback. That would be a scrolled and incorrect response. Also, if the learner gives multiple responses, you ask them point to cat, they point to dog and cat at the same time. If the instruction is not given, you say point to, and they point to dog, and you were going to ask for dog, but you hadn't sent that yet. Sorry, but that is incorrect. If the learner is not paying attention, you say point to cat, they're humming, looking out the window, and by chance they point to that cat, that would be incorrect. Also, if the learner displays problem behavior in the place of a response, you say point to cat, they kick you, and then they point to cat, that would be incorrect. The programming also needs to contain the instructor behavior for incorrect responses, and there might be a variety of different ways they do that. We're going to talk about some of those ways. They might instruct you to just give feedback, just give a model prompt, or use a 5-step error correction procedure, which would be more recommended. One common error correction response instructors give is to simply provide oral feedback. Show me square, they touch circle, and the instructor simply says, no, that's not it. This kind of correction is problematic because it doesn't teach the correct response. We might see situations where the instructor is simply giving a model prompt. The instructor says, show me square, they touch circle. The instructor says, oops, this one is square, while they touch square. The problem, again, with this type of correction is that the learner is not required to give the correct response to move on. More recommended error correction procedure might look like something like this, where you block, you prompt, you switch, retest, and reinforce. So let's take a look at that a little more in depth here. When possible, block incorrect responses from the child. So for example, you're working on point to square and you see the child is reaching for a circle. Reach out and block circle and give physical guidance for square. When blocking isn't possible, use the prompt strategy provided by your behavior analyst for that correct response. A great move after correcting an error is to throw in 1 to 3 high probability instructions. Just as a pro tip, you could use mastered programs. We're looking for the correct response to build momentum. So know your audience. Often imitation like hands up or clapping, or listener response, touch nose, touch tummy are good options, but mix it up. Could an interverbal work? What's your sister's name? What's your favorite food? The key point is that we're looking for correct responses. So try to keep a growing list of mastered targets and keep things fun, easy, and fast. After 1 to 3 distractor trials, present the original instruction with the mistake again and allow the child the chance to respond independently. Be ready in case you need to prompt. If a mistake is made, return to step 1, which would be block and prompt. And of course, reinforce. Give reinforcement for independent correct responses and use differential reinforcement. Say things like, you're trying, you're working hard, immediately after an error or a response given with a prompt. Keep in mind, what we are looking to do is to first correct an error, then support the learner, but then fade out our guidance. We want to put the child's most independent response closest to the reinforcement to fortify that response the most. So again, that procedure is block the incorrect response, prompt the correct response, switch, do a couple distractor trials, retest that response, and then reinforce. So altogether, this is what our DTT cover sheet should look like. It might look a little bit different depending on the program, but you're going to have that specific goal at the top. This is task 7, so you want to see that the learner generalizes tags across 3 examples of 50 items, tested or from a list of known generalizations. We're going to have that discriminatory stimulus and or environmental arrangement. So put cards set A 1 to 10 in a messy array in front of the learner. In random order, point to each card and present the SD. What's this? Correct response within 10 seconds of the SD. For example, the learner will correctly tag the item. The instructor behavior, verbal praise paired intermittently with tangibles or edibles. Incorrect responses might look like no response after 10 seconds. Your learner might have a different time criteria. An incorrect response, a scrolling response. What's the instructor behavior for that incorrect response? Repeat the SD and immediately follow it with an echoic prompt of the correct response, such as what's this, shoe. Verbally reinforce correct responses. If no response occurs after 3 prompts, conduct a preference assessment and then initiate the next trial. Mastery criterion, 80% or greater for 3 consecutive phases or 90% or greater for 2 consecutive phases. All right. It's really important, and that's at the heart of ABA, that we need to take data. We seek to take trial by trial data collection. This is one of the answers on the test at the end of this module, by the way. Every trial you should be taking data, writing that down so you don't, forget later. We use a standardization of learn units per data point. This is for supervisor evaluation. We try to use 10 data points for each procedure unless otherwise specified. This is what a data collection sheet might look like. We have a description of the goal here and space for possibly 8 trials. Usually it's 10, but it might depend. Couple different activities here. Safety awareness here, we might just have 2 or less occurrences per week. This is what another data sheet might look like. And as we fill it in, we just put a plus or a minus for a correct or incorrect response. We want to graph data daily. Take the score out of 10 to make a percentage. Graph the score in the binder and report any red dot procedures to your supervisor immediately. And we'll go into that, what that might look like in a minute. This is what a graph might look like. So when you fill that in, you're going to put the dates across the bottom and then their percentage out of 10. They got 40%, then 60%, 70, 80. And up here, they mastered it with 3 data points at 80% or more for 3 consecutive days. That's something you'd want to let your supervisor know. Programs will almost always be moved to the next phase when they meet that 80% for 3 or 90% for 2 consecutive sessions. So you want to call, text, or email your supervisor to notify them of the phase changes or red dots ASAP, which would mean within 24 hours. Red dot criteria would be 5 data points at 50% or below, or 20 data points without a phase change. If you don't run a procedure that day, mark the data collection sheet and graph with the rationale. You can use these codes. You don't always have to write a big description. You might say O for outing, S for child sleeping, T for tantrum, TR for training, IV if you didn't get 10 trials or you ran out of time, NA for no opportunity, and OH for on hold. And this can be marked on the day the hold started and does not need to be marked again until the goal is reintroduced. This might be in a case where, for example, you need to get the flashcards from the clinic before you can start that trial, for example, or your supervisor is bringing in stimuli. Take session notes each day at the end of session. Note things that went well or were unusual. Don't just say good day. Note any new reinforcers or fun things you did, or what you did to make the day go well, or what happened to set the occasion for a tantrum. So let's talk about what is a behavior intervention plan, or BIP. A behavior intervention plan is a written document that is generated with information on the learner's behavioral excesses, evaluation of the function, and informed by proactive and reactive plans for dealing with the excesses by way of a scientifically proven intervention plan. It's put together based on the results of the learner's functional behavior assessment, or FBA, performed by the behavior analyst, and a lot of times with the help from you, the behavior tech. BIPs are written by supervisors. It's out of the competency of the ABA tech to put together a BIP. Still, it's essential that a tech know what are common components found in the BIP and how they should be used. What are the contents of a BIP? We want to have a clear description of the behavior. We want to know what the precursors or signal behavior might look like. We want a description of when the behavior starts or stops. We want to see an example and non-example of the behavior, possibly an escalation chain description. We want to know what the function of the behavior is, as well as the frequency of the behavior and the final objective of the intervention. We want to know what the severity is, when the behavior started to occur, how old was the learner when it started, antecedents of the behavior, current consequences, what would prevent the behavior from happening, as well as, most importantly, proactive strategies or strategies to avoid that behavior from happening, keep it from happening. And we also want to have some reactive strategies. What do we do when it starts? Here's what a BIP might look like. So for example, what's the behavior? Bobby engages in tantrum behavior. Well, what's a tantrum for Bobby? It might look different for every kid, right? A tantrum is defined as the behavior of Bobby screaming or crying and throwing himself on the floor for more than 10 seconds. What are the precursors? Bobby starts asking more than once for items or activities. What does it look like? What moment can I say it started? A tantrum begins when Bobby screams or cries and throws himself on the floor. A tantrum ends when Bobby stops crying and no tears come out for at least 20 seconds. What's an example of the behavior? Bobby asks for Doritos and Dad says no. Bobby throws himself on the floor and cries very loudly for 7 minutes. What's a non-example of the behavior? Bobby's sister picks up a toy that is on the floor near him. He throws himself on the floor, gets up, and continues playing. That's not a tantrum. What's the function of this behavior? The hypothesis is that the tantrum has a function of access to items, especially food. And it is happening with a frequency of 2.71 times a day. What's our final objective? What's the objective of our intervention here? The final criteria would be for this behavior to occur 1 or fewer times per month. Severity, moderate. This behavior causes some barriers for Bobby socially and in the learning environment. When did it start? He has had these tantrums since he was 1.5, but it's becoming less frequent. Antecedent, what happens before this behavior occurs? Often denied access to food or other tangibles. What are current consequences? Bobby continues to have access denied. What would likely prevent this behavior from occurring? Leaving preferred food and other items and free access. Not that we're going to do this, but just so we know, and this kind of points to the function here. So now we have a list of proactive strategies, and these are strategies we put in place to keep that behavior from happening. So we can help them build a tolerance and build skills. We're going to use, for example, verbal preparation with a visual aid, like a first then board, so he can understand and have better previsibility of when he might have access to those preferred items. A visual aid of when items are or aren't available. Rewards for successful behavior. Don't use the word no. Offer other options. Functional communication training to request items when available. So we would have man training already included in Bobby's programming. Tokens or a DRO program where we have contingent rewards in the absence of problem behavior. So for every 15 minutes that Bobby doesn't have a tantrum for access to these items, we might provide access to these items or other items. And we're also going to put locks on cabinets in the fridge. Reactive strategies. Here is a list of strategies that we put in place when that behavior has begun. So when we have moments of this tantrum behavior for access, we're not going to give, or at least we're going to minimize attention. In situation where Bobby manages to get an item, don't interfere or take it from his hand. We're going to give access to the food at that moment, but as soon as Bobby is at a safe distance away, we're going to remove that item and lock the cabinets in the refrigerator again. We're also going to redirect that child. All right, we have reached our Module 9 review. Please grab your worksheets and answer the questions on there. Module 9, question 1. The skill acquisition program. Question 2. True or false? A learner can get a correct score if they respond before the SD is delivered. Question 3. True or false? A learner can get a correct score if they respond without visually attending to the materials. Question 4. Bobby's staff asked him to point to Dad. Bobby first pointed to Mom, but then he saw that his staff person didn't say good job, so he pointed to Dad. Is this a correct response? What is scrolling? Question 5. Question 6. How often should data be collected during your shift? Question 7. The Behavior Intervention Program, Plan, or BIP. Question 8. I gave a longer list, but what are at least 4 examples of incorrect responses? Question 9. What are 2 red dot criteria? You have completed Module 9. Module 10, Disabilities. Outline of Module 10. We're going to talk about the definition of autism spectrum disorder, including common characteristics, definition of intellectual disabilities, including how it is categorized, the definition of Down syndrome and typical variations in presentation, and the definition of ADHD, including subtypes and typical presentation. Here's a list of disabilities often supported through ABA practices. There's autism, intellectual disabilities, Prader-Willis syndrome, Fragile X, fetal alcohol syndrome, Down syndrome, and ADHD, among others. What is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD? ASD is a developmental disability that affects how a person perceives and interacts with the world. It is characterized by a combination of challenges in social communication and interaction and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior and interests. ASD exists on a spectrum, which means that symptoms can vary widely depending on person and from person to person. Just to give you a bit of the history here, Leo Kanner first defined criteria for autism in 1943. Autism comes from the word auto or self. When Leo Kanner first defined autism, at the time there was no differentiation in autism. Autism was just autism. Autism spectrum disorder, ASD, affects around 1 in 36 children. ASD is prevalent across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. The prevalence of ASD is significantly higher, 4 times higher in boys compared to girls. Autism is diagnosed based on behavior and development. There is no medical test. There's no blood test for autism. Doctors use observation, parent input, and developmental history to identify it. People with autism frequently also have other disorders like intellectual disability. This makes it essential to diagnose autism correctly and get the right treatment. There are a lot of common myths about autism, but they aren't true. One common myth is that people with ASD can't show affection. Absolutely. If you've met any of our kiddos, that's not true. That they don't know how to communicate. A lot of them can learn and do learn with ABA to communicate. Other myths are that they are aggressive and dangerous. They're incapable of living independently. They don't make eye contact. They can't display emotions. They are unruly and choose to display inappropriate behaviors. And that also another common myth is that autism is caused by bad parenting. What are some red flags that a child may have autism? Some red flags are that they do not babble or coo by 12 months of age. They do not gesture, such as point, wave, or grasp by 12 months. They don't say a single word by 16 months. They don't say any two-word phrases on his or her own by 24 months. They have any child that displays a loss of any language or social skill before the age of 3, that could be a red flag, that there's no social referencing. If you see the individual lining up toys, this could be a sign, or you might see a lack of eye contact. There are variations in development, and you're going to find that autism is categorized in 3 core areas. In the area of language and development, some individuals with ASD may be nonverbal, while others may have advanced vocabularies in specific areas. Communications styles can vary from echolalia to very literal interpretations of language. For this reason, alternative and augmentative communication, or AAC devices, can be helpful for some individuals. In the area of social interaction delays or deficits, the degree of social challenges can vary. Some individuals may have difficulty making eye contact, while others may struggle with understanding complex social situations. Social skills can be learned and improved over time with support and intervention. The other core area is the area of repetitive behaviors and interests. Repetitive behaviors can range from mild stimming to more disruptive behaviors. Sensory sensitivities can be specific to loud noises, for example, or more general, textures, for example. Understanding the reasons behind behaviors can help develop positive strategies for managing these behaviors. In that core area of language and communication, you might see difficulty with verbal and nonverbal communication, delays in speech development, difficulty understanding figurative language such as sarcasm or idioms, very literal interpretations of language, and a strong focus on specific topics. Just to expand on that, how does this manifest itself in the area of language and communication? You might see a delay in or total lack of the development of spoken language, marked impairment in the ability to initiate or sustain a conversation with others, stereotyped and repetitive use of language. a lack of varied, spontaneous make-believe play or social imitative play or appropriate to developmental level. In the core area of social interaction, you might see challenges with understanding social cues, such as facial expressions, body language, or tone of voice. You might see difficulty understanding the emotions of others, or difficulty making and keeping friends the common way. How do these deficits in social interaction manifest themselves? You might see impairments in the use of nonverbal behavior, such as eye-to-eye gaze, facial expressions, body postures, and gestures to regulate social interaction. You might see the failure to develop peer relationships appropriate to developmental level, or the lack of social and emotional reciprocity, a lack of spontaneous seeking to share enjoyment, interests, or achievements with other people, such as by a lack of showing, bringing, or pointing out objects of interest. In the core area of repetitive behaviors and interests, you might see repetitive movements. That person might be more comfortable with sameness and routines. They might display sensory sensitivities or self-stimulation, such as stimming. How does this manifest itself? They might have encompassing preoccupation with one or more stereotyped and restricted patterns of interest that's abnormal, either in intensity or focus. Stereotyped and repetitive motor mannerisms, for example, hand or finger flapping, or twisting or complex whole body movements. They might be apparently inflexible. They might have an apparent inflexible adherence to specific non-functional routines or rituals, or persistent preoccupation with parts of objects. You might see behaviors that are related to these core areas. When you see that resistance to environmental change, that could be related to the repetitive or stereotyped patterns of behavior. Echolalia has to do with repetitive behaviors as well as communication. Scripted language is from the area of communication. So they're just quoting a movie or quoting a song or just repeating what someone else has said. They might show a lack of interest in people from the core area of socialization. They might have attention difficulties, and that's from the areas of socialization and communication. They might have difficulty generalizing concepts. This could come from all three core areas. They might display difficulties with learning by observation and imitation from the core area of socialization. And they might show difficulty taking the perspective of others from the core area of socialization. Uneven patterns of strengths and weaknesses could be all three of these areas. They may quickly overload by seemingly small things from the area of repetitive and restricted interests. They might show a resistance to change in daily routines or transitions or making transitions from one activity to another from the core area of repetitive and restricted interests. Common presentations of ASD in early childhood, you're going to see delays in speech and language development, social isolation, repetitive behaviors, and resistance to change. For a school-age child, you might see difficulty with social interaction, challenges with organization and planning, an intense focus on specific interests or sensory sensitivities. When the individual is a teen or adult, you might see social awkwardness, anxiety, depression, struggles with independent living, potential for excelling in certain fields as well. Levi and Perry in 2011 studied the outcomes of individuals with autism spectrum disorder in education, employment, and independent living. They found that while many individuals with ASD complete secondary education, a significant portion, this is 50 to 60%, do so without vocational or academic qualifications. Only a small number, and that's 5 to 40%, go on to higher education. In terms of employment, only a quarter of individuals with ASD find work, and job security is often low. However, there are some notable exceptions with successful careers. While a small number of individuals with ASD live independently, most, probably 50 to 60%, continue to live at home or in supported housing. Those with higher functioning ASD are more likely to live independently. Relationships and marriage are uncommon among individuals with ASD, with only a small percentage, 5 to 10%, reporting such experiences. Saini et al. Found that while divorce rates among parents of autistic children, like 23.5%, are lower than the general population of 46%, they are still higher than families with children with other disabilities or without disabilities. Marital dissatisfaction and troubled marriages are also more common in these families. Positive reflections, however, on the lighter side of having an autistic child have been linked to an improved marital quality. Themes like self-improvement, family strengthening, and a sense of greater purpose can also contribute to increased parental satisfaction. Parenting a child with autism is associated with higher levels of stress and depression, which may or may not be new to the parents. Inappropriate behaviors can disrupt routines and social life, adding to stress. This stress seems to have a greater impact on women's marital satisfaction than men. Also, the severity of other ASD symptoms, this does not appear to affect marital satisfaction as much as problem behavior, which can have a negative impact. Hervoitsky et al. Compared the lifespan of individuals with ASD to the general population. They found that on average, individuals with ASD live shorter lives with an average of 53.87 years than the general population, which has an average of 70.2 years. High-functioning individuals with ASD live longer. They have an average longer lifespan of 58.39 years compared to low-functioning individuals with 39.5 years. While individuals with ASD are less likely to engage in unhealthy behaviors like drinking, smoking, or risky driving, factors like comorbid conditions and accidental death can contribute to this lower lifespan. As noted by Levi and Perry in 2011, these factors can significantly impact life expectancy. Levi and Perry found that the prognosis was generally poor, with many individuals unable to live independently in terms of assessing the general quality of life. They found that, however, higher functioning individuals often had better outcomes in education, independent living, and social relationships. Lockyer and Rutter developed a scale to measure prognosis in autism. Before 1990, only about 25% of individuals with autism were considered to have a good prognosis. However, this scale was primarily designed for higher functioning individuals and may not accurately reflect the prognosis for all individuals with autism. Levi and Perry also found that individuals who did not develop functional speech by the age of 5 or 6 generally had poorer outcomes. In terms of social outcomes such as education, employment, independent living, and social relationships, outcomes for individuals with autism have improved over time. A higher quality of life increased to around 20%, while low quality of life decreased to around 45% in the 2000s. Levi and Perry also found that optimal outcomes are estimated to be between 25 and 30%. As with other studies, high-functioning individuals tend to have better outcomes. While autism has no known cure, some studies suggest that a small number of individuals who were once diagnosed with autism may no longer meet the criteria for the diagnosis later in life. This phenomenon has been reported by authors like Levi and Perry and Seltzer et al. This phenomenon is referred to as optimal outcomes when they no longer meet that criteria. Seltzer et al. Conducted a 40-year study of 405 individuals diagnosed with autism as children. They found that only 54.8% of these individuals still met the diagnostic criteria for autism as adults. This change could be attributed to a variety of factors such as maturation, the impact of treatment, changes in diagnostic practices, or a combination of these factors. Based on their meta-analysis, Levi and Perry estimate that optimal outcomes for individuals with autism occur in 3 to 25% of cases. These optimal outcomes are possible, but they require expanded services across the autism spectrum, regardless of an individual's prognosis. Cognitive functioning in individuals with autism generally improves or remains stable over time. However, more research is needed to determine if a minority of individuals experience cognitive decline. Levi and Perry found that 20 to 55% of individuals showed cognitive improvement, 20 to 70% showed stability, and 10 to 15% showed decline. These declines may be related to the assessment tools used or indicate a plateau in growth. Limited language skills and comorbid conditions such as epilepsy have been associated with poor prognoses and the potential deterioration of symptoms. There is strong evidence that language development and IQ at age 5 or 6 are highly predictive of future outcomes for children with autism. And this has been confirmed by studies by Howland and Moss, Howland et al., and Levi and Perry. Intellectual disabilities, or ID, is characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and adaptive skills. Adaptive skills refer to the ability to perform everyday activities like self-care, communication, and social interaction. ID is diagnosed using standardized tests and clinical evaluation. A diagnosis of ID typically involves a two-pronged approach. There's the standardized testing, so IQ tests are a common tool used to assess intellectual functioning. However, a single low score is not enough for a diagnosis. There's also the adaptive behavior assessment, which is where standardized scales are used to evaluate a person's ability to perform daily activities like self-care, communication, and social interaction. These assess how limitations in intellectual functioning translate to real-world challenges. Clinical evaluations by qualified professionals are also crucial for a complete picture. These may involve observations, interviews with the individual and caregivers, and considering medical history. ID is categorized into these 4 categories of mild, moderate, severe, and profound intellectual disabilities. Mild ID requires an IQ between 50 and 70 points. This is the most common category. Individuals may learn basic life skills, read at a basic level, and hold simple jobs with support. For moderate ID, we see IQ points between 35 and 49 points. People with moderate ID may require ongoing support with daily living activities like communication and self-care. They may develop basic academic skills and potentially hold supervised jobs. For severe intellectual disabilities, we're going to see IQ points between 20 and 34 points. Individuals with severe ID may have limited communication skills and require significant support with most daily activities. For profound ID, we're going to find an IQ of below 20. People with profound intellectual disabilities have very limited verbal communication and require constant care for all daily needs. For learners with intellectual disabilities, only 37% go on to university. The percent of adults with intellectual disabilities who find employment is 44%, with 21 unemployed and 28% who will never work during their lifetime. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities can live as long as those without, with life expectancies ranging from the mid-50s for those with more severe disabilities to the early 70s for those with milder impairments. Down syndrome is a genetic condition caused by the presence of all or part of an extra copy of chromosome 21. Typically, people have 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs of chromosomes, but in Down syndrome, there are 47 chromosomes with an extra partial or full copy of chromosome 21. This extra genetic material alters how the body and brain develop, leading to characteristic physical features and developmental delays. With facial features, you might see a flattened facial profile, a small nose with a broad bridge, upward slanting eyes, and the ears are and smaller ears are commonly seen. Individuals with Down syndrome tend to be shorter than average height. This can lead to joint laxity and a characteristic posture with the hypotonia that is experienced. The common presentation of Down syndrome, well, we might see developmental delays, speech and language delays, delays in social interaction, hearing and vision problems, learning difficulties, and heart defects. What's a typical variations in presentation? You might see variations in the severity of symptoms, the severity of intellectual disability and developmental delays can vary widely. Some individuals may function within the mild to moderate range, while others may have more significant challenges. In terms of speech and language skills, the level of communication skills can vary greatly. Some individuals may be nonverbal, while others may develop strong verbal communication skills with support. In terms of social skills, the level of social interaction and understanding of social cues can also vary significantly. With medical conditions, the presence and severity of co-occurring medical conditions such as heart defects or thyroid issues also can vary. Definite statistics for individuals with Down syndrome in terms of academic life, marriage, and work, they do not exist at the time, but going to university and or becoming married have become increasingly common due to our ever-changing society. Kuhlman and Schoenbrot found that 57% of adults with Down syndrome had paid employment, while 26% were doing volunteer work and 3% of individuals were self-employed. Still, 30% of the sample group were unemployed. In terms of life expectancy, Kuhlman and Schoenbrot also found that average life expectancy for people with Down syndrome in this day and age is over 50 years of age. This compares with an average of less than 10 years of age in the 1900s. These authors found that the speech speech segmentation and initiating joint attention were the most significant factors in significant factors predicting future language development in typically developing infants. In contrast, for infants with Down syndrome, nonverbal cognitive skills and responding to joint attention were primary indicators of subsequent language acquisition. In terms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, this is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by persistent patterns of inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity that interfere with daily life and are inappropriate for the individual's developmental level. Symptoms typically begin in childhood and can persist into adulthood, and you're going to see that combination of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsiveness. You're going to see individuals with a predominantly inattentive presentation make careless mistakes in schoolwork or at work. They have difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. They may fail to complete chores, errands, or duties in the workplace. They have difficulties organizing tasks or activities. They lose track of conversations or materials needed for the task. They're easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, and they may be forgetful in daily activities. Those with a predominantly hyperactive or impulsive presentation fidget or squirm in their seats, may have difficulty remaining seated when required. They seem to be on the go constantly. They talk excessively, may blurt out answers before questions are completed. They may have difficulty waiting their turn, interrupt conversations or others' activities. They may engage in risky or impulsive behaviors without considering the consequences. And we, of course, may see a combined presentation, and this is the most common presentation where individuals experience symptoms of both inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity. Um, what would be the typical presentation? In terms of inattention, we might see difficulty focusing and paying attention, frequent daydreaming, difficulty completing tasks, difficulty following instruction, disorganization and forgetfulness, and an individual who is easily distracted. In terms of impulsivity, we might see an individual who's blurting out answers, interrupting others, has difficulty waiting their turn, is acting without thinking about the consequences and taking risks. With hyperactivity, we might see an individual who's restless and fidgety, engages in excessive talking, has difficulty sitting still, difficulty taking turns, running or climbing excessively, especially in terms of younger children. This author reported that 16% of university students actually have ADHD. Marriage is very common with individuals with ADHD. However, studies suggest that divorce is twice as common when one of the partners has ADHD compared to the rest of the population. In terms of life expectancy, research indicates that individuals with persistent ADHD experience a life expectancy that was approximately 13 years shorter than the control group. For those whose ADHD symptoms were resolved, the reduction in life expectancy was around 7 to 8 years. Additionally, individuals with ADHD, regardless of symptom persistence, had a higher number of years marked by poor health outcomes. All right, we have reached the Module 10 review. Please answer the following questions on your worksheet. Module 10, question 1. Which developmental delay is characterized by a combination of challenges in social communication and interaction and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior or interests? Question 2. True or false? Autism spectrum disorder has a very typical presentation for all individuals who have a diagnosis. Question 3. Which developmental delay is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by persistent patterns of inattention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity that interfere with daily life and are inappropriate for the individual's developmental level? Question 4. Which developmental delay is characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and adaptive skills? Question 5. Which developmental delay is a genetic condition caused by the presence of all or part of an extra copy of chromosome 21? Question 6. Which blood test is used to diagnose for autism? Question 7. What are the 3 core areas of autism? You have now completed your ABA training. Please finish filling out your worksheet, review modules if needed, and send these in to be graded.